In a quiet suburb just outside the city's rush, Sarah Jennings, a seasoned FBI agent with a commendable track record, found herself in a situation she had read about but never expected to experience firsthand. Sarah, an African-American woman in her mid-30s, was known for her sharp intellect and dedication to justice, which had earned her respect and a series of successful cases under her belt. On this day, she was off duty, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, driving to meet a friend for coffee. It was a routine drive on a sunny afternoon, the kind that promised laughter and catch-ups. As Sarah approached a rather deserted stretch of road, her pleasant anticipation was abruptly interrupted by the flashing lights of a police car in her rearview mirror. With a frown, she checked her speedometer and, finding nothing amiss, pulled over, expecting perhaps a routine check or a mistaken stop. A white police officer approached her car, his face set in a stern expression that didn't quite reach his eyes, which flickered with something unreadable. "License and registration," the officer demanded without a greeting, his tone harsh and commanding. Sarah complied, handing over her credentials calmly, her FBI badge included, hoping to clarify any misunderstandings about her identity from the start. "I'm off duty." "Is there a problem, officer?" Sarah inquired, her voice steady despite the growing unease. The officer glanced at her badge but quickly dismissed it. "Step out of the vehicle," he insisted, ignoring her identification. Confused but aware of the need to remain composed, Sarah stepped out, her mind racing through possible reasons for his behavior. As she stood by her car, the officer's demeanor grew more accusing. "We've had reports of suspicious activities involving a vehicle matching this description," he stated, surveying her car with exaggerated suspicion. Sarah knew her rights and her responsibilities, but also the delicate nature of such encounters. "Officer, I assure you this is a misunderstanding. I'm heading to meet a friend, and I'd be happy to verify any details you need to check," Sarah offered, her voice a mix of professionalism and weariness. It wasn't uncommon for law enforcement officers to be overly cautious, but something about this stop felt unnecessarily confrontational. The officer seemed uninterested in dialogue. "Turn around. Put your hands behind your back. You're being detained until we clear this up," he declared, moving to handcuff her before she could respond. Sarah complied, the cool metal of the cuffs contrasting sharply with the warm air. Her mind flashed through her training on de-escalation, on legal rights, on the countless stories of racial profiling she had helped investigate. Now, caught in the gears of a system she worked within, Sarah felt a mix of disbelief and a resolve to handle the situation with the dignity and calm required, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated further. As she stood handcuffed by the side of her own car, the reality of the moment sunk in. This was not just a simple traffic stop. It was a test of her resolve, and perhaps a chance to influence a much-needed change, starting with one officer's misconceived perceptions. Sarah stood by the side of her car, the handcuffs around her wrists a stark reminder of the rapidly escalating situation. She remained composed, her training as an FBI agent providing a firm backbone of calm in the chaos. The officer, meanwhile, showed no signs of easing his aggressive stance. He radioed in the incident, his words clipped and brisk, "Suspect detained, awaiting further instructions." As they waited for a response from the dispatcher, the officer kept a close watch on Sarah, who used the opportunity to further assert her position. "Officer, I think there's been a serious mistake here. I am an FBI agent, and you have detained me without probable cause," she stated clearly, hoping to reason with him. The officer, however, seemed unfazed by her credentials. "We'll see about that," he muttered, barely glancing her way. The tension in the air was palpable, and Sarah could feel the eyes of passers-by on them, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. She knew how critical it was to maintain her dignity and professionalism, despite the unfairness of her treatment. Minutes dragged on, and finally, the officer received a response over his radio. Instead of clarifying the situation, it seemed to embolden him. "Backup's on the way. We're taking you in for questioning," he announced, his tone indicating that he wasn't interested in further discussion. Sarah was led to the back of the police car, the metal of the handcuffs biting slightly into her skin as she was helped into the vehicle. Inside, the reality of the situation began to fully dawn on her. She was an FBI agent, accustomed to being on the other side of these exchanges. Now she was the one being questioned, her freedom curtailed by cuffs and accusations. She thought about her family, her friends, and how they would react to seeing her in this position. It was a humbling and infuriating moment. As they drove to the station, Sarah went over her rights and possible next steps in her mind. She knew the law well, and she knew her detention was baseless. The drive was quiet. The officer focused on the road, leaving Sarah to her thoughts. She planned her next moves, how she would explain this situation to her superiors, and how she would address it legally later on. Upon arrival at the station, Sarah was led inside, her presence causing a stir among the other officers. Some recognized her. Whispers of "Isn't that Agent Jennings?" filled the air, adding to the complexity of the situation. The officer who had arrested her seemed to ignore these murmurs, his face set in determination. Sarah was processed and placed in a holding area, a stark, sterile room that felt cold and unwelcoming. As she sat there, the door opened, and a senior officer she recognized walked in. His expression was a mix of surprise and concern. "Agent Jennings, what on earth are you doing here?" he asked, his tone conveying his disbelief. The story of her detention began to unravel then, the threads of misunderstanding and misconduct slowly being pulled apart by the presence of someone who knew her and understood the gravity of the mistake that had been made. As Sarah sat in the holding area, the senior officer, Captain Miller, took it upon himself to clarify the confusion. His face bore a serious expression, reflecting both concern and urgency as he began to understand the gravity of the situation. He quickly ordered Sarah's immediate release from the handcuffs and invited her into his office for a more comfortable conversation. Inside Captain Miller's office, the atmosphere was tense but professional. Sarah explained the events leading up to her arrest, her voice steady despite the ordeal. Captain Miller listened intently, nodding occasionally, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was clear that he was piecing together the mistakes that had led to this significant error. "I apologize, Agent Jennings. This shouldn't have happened to you or anyone else. I'll make sure we review our procedures," Captain Miller assured her, his tone sincere. Sarah appreciated his directness and the acknowledgement of the mistake. It was a small comfort, but a necessary step toward addressing the broader issues at play. Meanwhile, the officer who had arrested Sarah was called into the office. He entered hesitantly, his earlier confidence replaced by a noticeable unease. Captain Miller wasted no time addressing him directly. "Officer Davis, can you explain why you ignored Agent Jennings' identification and proceeded with the arrest?" he asked, his voice firm yet fair. Officer Davis fumbled with his words, his explanation tinged with hesitation. I thought it was a fake ID. We had reports of suspicious activities, and I acted based on that information." He stuttered, avoiding Sarah's gaze. His answer did little to satisfy Captain Miller, who pressed further, emphasizing the importance of verifying facts and respecting citizens' rights, especially those of fellow law enforcement officers. As the conversation unfolded, Sarah sat quietly, observing the dynamics. She was keenly aware of the educational opportunity this incident provided. It was a real-life example of the kind of racial profiling and misjudgments she often taught about in workshops and seminars. Captain Miller concluded the meeting with a decision to have Officer Davis undergo additional training focused on racial sensitivity and proper identification verification. He also promised a full review of the arrest protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. After the meeting, Sarah was free to leave, but the experience had left its mark. She walked out of the police station with mixed feelings. There was relief at being vindicated, but also a renewed determination to advocate for change within the system. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the parking lot as she approached her car, the events of the day replaying in her mind. As she drove away, Sarah's thoughts turned to the broader implications of her arrest. She realized that her experience, while troubling, could serve as a catalyst for positive change. The thought was somewhat comforting, giving her a sense of purpose and a clear vision for her next steps. She knew she had a unique platform and the professional credibility to push for meaningful reforms that could one day prevent such an error from happening to someone else. As Sarah drove away from the police station, her hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. She was free, but the weight of what had just happened stayed with her. It wasn't just about her being arrested. It was about something bigger. If an FBI agent could be treated this way, what about those who didn't have a badge to defend themselves? She pulled into a quiet coffee shop, needing a moment to think. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and the soft hum of conversation filled the air, offering a contrast to the tense moments she had just experienced. As she sat at a small table in the corner, she replayed the events in her mind. The officer's immediate doubt, his refusal to listen, the handcuffs. It all pointed to a problem that went beyond just one person's mistake. Taking a deep breath, she pulled out her phone and dialed her supervisor at the FBI, Special Agent Carter. He answered almost immediately. "Sarah, I just got off the phone with Captain Miller. Are you all right?" His voice carried both concern and frustration. "I'm fine," Sarah assured him, though she wasn't sure if that was entirely true. But this wasn't just a misunderstanding, Carter. It was something else. And it's not the first time things like this have happened. Carter sighed. "I know. We've seen cases like this before. What are you thinking?" Sarah looked out the window, watching as people walked past the cafe, completely unaware of what had happened to her just an hour ago. "I want to do something about it," she said, her voice firm. "This shouldn't just end with an apology. There needs to be change. Real change." Carter was silent for a moment, then said, "I had a feeling you'd say that. I support you, but you need a plan. You need to show people why this isn't just about you." Sarah nodded to herself. He was right. If she wanted to make a difference, she couldn't just speak about what had happened. She needed to turn it into something productive. The next day, she reached out to colleagues, legal experts, and community leaders, gathering information and strategies. She wanted to develop training programs for officers on handling stops properly, especially when it came to recognizing bias. More than that, she wanted to push for policy changes that ensured proper accountability. But not everyone was supportive. Some officers at the station felt uncomfortable with the attention the case was getting. "Are you saying we're all bad cops?" One officer scoffed when he overheard her talking about reform. "No," Sarah answered calmly, meeting his gaze. "But the system isn't perfect, and we should all want it to be better." Word of her efforts started spreading, and soon, local news stations wanted interviews. People in the community began talking. Some were inspired by her determination, while others resisted, unwilling to admit there was a problem. Sarah knew this was just the beginning, but she was ready. She had spent her career fighting for justice. Now she had a new battle to fight, and she wasn't backing down. Sarah's decision to push for change was met with mixed reactions. Some people applauded her for taking a stand, while others dismissed her efforts as unnecessary. She wasn't surprised. Change was never easy, but she also knew that real progress required persistence. She began working with legal experts and community leaders to draft a proposal for better law enforcement training programs. She wanted officers to undergo more practical sessions on handling stops, recognizing bias, and de-escalation techniques. It wasn't about targeting anyone. It was about making sure that what happened to her wouldn't happen to someone else. As she gathered support, Captain Miller reached out to her. They met in his office at the police station, the same place where she had been wrongfully detained just days ago. "I want to be clear," Captain Miller said, leaning forward. "I know what happened to you was wrong. But there are people in the department who feel like you're turning this into a bigger issue than it needs to be." Sarah met his gaze without hesitation. "It is a big issue, Captain. If this can happen to an FBI agent, Imagine what happens to regular people who don't have a badge to defend themselves. This isn't about me. It's about fixing something that's broken. Captain Miller sighed and rubbed his temples. He wasn't a bad man, Sarah knew that. He had always tried to do the right thing. What exactly are you proposing? He finally asked. Sarah took out a folder and slid it across the desk. This is a plan for a training program. It's designed to help officers handle situations like mine better. It focuses on understanding bias, improving identification verification, and preventing unnecessary escalations. Captain Miller flipped through the pages, nodding slowly. You've really thought this through. I have, Sarah said. And I'm not doing this to attack anyone. I'm doing it because I believe we can do better. And I think you do too. For a moment, Captain Miller remained silent. Then he set the folder down and leaned back in his chair. I'll take this to the higher-ups. No promises, but I'll push for it. Sarah knew that was the best she could ask for at the moment. That's all I need, she said with a determined smile. As she left the office, she felt a sense of purpose. She had started something important. The real challenge was just beginning, but she was ready for it. In the following weeks, Sarah's story gained even more attention. News outlets picked it up, and people across the country began discussing the issue. Some police departments reached out, interested in implementing similar training programs. Not everyone was supportive. Some officers resisted, unwilling to change the way things had always been done. But Sarah didn't let that discourage her. She knew that real change didn't happen overnight. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been treated unfairly. And no matter how difficult it got, she wasn't going to stop. Sarah's fight for change was not easy. Every step forward seemed to bring new resistance. Some officers felt uncomfortable with the conversation she was starting. Others believed that her efforts made them look bad. But she wasn't trying to target anyone. She was trying to make things better for everyone. One afternoon, as she walked into the FBI office, her supervisor, Special Agent Carter, called her into his office. He gestured for her to sit, his expression unreadable. "You've been making waves, Sarah," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Some good, some complicated." Sarah knew what that meant. "I'm not going to stop," she said firmly. "This is bigger than me." Carter nodded. "I didn't expect you to. That's why I called you in. We have some departments reaching out. Some are open to the training program you're proposing." Sarah felt a flicker of hope. "Really? Which ones?" Carter slid a file across the desk. 3 precincts are willing to test it. If it works, we might be able to push it further. Sarah flipped through the file, excitement growing inside her. This was more than she had expected. "This is huge," she said. Carter smirked. "Don't get too excited. It's just a start. You'll have to prove that this program is effective." Sarah knew the real work was just beginning. Over the next few weeks, she worked tirelessly, meeting with officers, organizing workshops, and speaking to police academies. She wanted to show them that proper training could help prevent unnecessary mistakes. Some officers were open to learning, but others resisted. One officer at a training session crossed his arms and shook his head. "I don't see the point of this. I've been doing this job for years. We don't need to change how we do things." Sarah stayed calm. "It's not about you personally. It's about making sure mistakes don't happen. Imagine being on the other side of that situation. Wouldn't you want to be treated fairly?" The officer didn't answer right away, but Sarah could see a flicker of understanding in his expression. That was enough for now. As time passed, the training programs showed results. Officers became more aware of their actions during stops, and reports of unnecessary escalations decreased in the departments that had implemented the program. One day, Captain Miller called Sarah. "You might want to hear this," he said, and then he played an audio recording of an officer on duty. "We have a potential suspect, but I verified their ID. Everything checks out. No need to escalate," the officer reported over the radio. Sarah smiled. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Change was happening, even if it was slow. She hung up and sat back, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what she had worked for. She wasn't done yet, but she had made a difference, and that was enough to keep going. Sarah's efforts were finally starting to make a difference, but she knew there was still a long way to go. Change didn't happen overnight. It took time, patience, and persistence. Every success gave her hope, but every bit of resistance reminded her of how much work was still needed. One evening, she received a message from an officer who had attended one of her training sessions. His name was Officer Ramirez, and he had been skeptical at first, like many others. But his message surprised her. "Agent Jennings, I wanted to thank you. I had a situation today where I stopped someone who seemed suspicious. A year ago, I might have handled it differently, but I remembered what you said about taking a step back and verifying the facts first. Turns out, the guy was just lost and looking for directions. Could have been a bad situation, but it wasn't. Thought you should know." Sarah read the message twice, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. It was proof that her work mattered. It wasn't just about policies or training. It was about changing the way people thought and acted. Even small shifts in mindset could make a big difference in someone's life. The next morning, she had a meeting with Captain Miller. He had been watching the results of the training program closely, and he had news for her. "We're expanding the program," he said, sliding a report across the table. "More precincts are willing to implement the training. Higher-ups are taking notice." Sarah took the report, scanning the pages. Departments in other cities had begun reaching out, asking for details about how to bring the program to their officers. It was bigger than she had imagined. "This is amazing," she said, looking up. "I never thought we'd get this far so soon." Captain Miller smirked. "Well, you didn't give us much of a choice. You kept pushing." Sarah laughed. "That's what I do." But while things were improving, not everyone was on board. Some officers still saw the training as unnecessary. Others felt defensive, as if acknowledging the need for change meant admitting they had done something wrong. One afternoon, as she was walking out of the precinct, she overheard a conversation between two officers. One of them, a younger recruit, was telling his partner, "I don't get it. Why do we need all this new training? We already know how to do our jobs." His partner, an older officer who had attended the training, responded, "It's not about us. It's about the people we serve. If we can do our jobs better, why wouldn't we?" Sarah didn't interrupt, but she smiled as she walked past. That was exactly the kind of mindset she was hoping to encourage. Change was happening, not all at once, and not without challenges, but it was happening. And for Sarah, that was worth every struggle, every long night, and every difficult conversation. She wasn't done yet. There was still more to do. But she had started something important, and she wasn't going to stop now. As the months passed, the results of Sarah's hard work started to unfold in ways she hadn't fully expected. The training programs were not just improving the way officers handled situations. They were changing the culture within the departments. Officers who once saw their jobs as purely about law enforcement were now beginning to view them as a responsibility to protect and serve their communities with more understanding and empathy. Sarah received an invitation to speak at a national law enforcement conference, where she was asked to share her story and the progress of the training programs. Standing in front of a crowd of law enforcement professionals from all over the country, Sarah felt a surge of pride. This was the moment she had been working for. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated, for everyone who deserved better. As law enforcement officers, we are entrusted with something very important: the safety and trust of the people we serve, she began. It's easy to forget that every decision we make affects real lives. That's why we need to constantly ask ourselves, are we acting with fairness? Are we doing what's right, not just what's easiest? Her words resonated with the audience. By the end of her speech, Sarah was greeted with applause. But more than that, she could see that her message was sinking in. Officers who had initially resisted the idea of changing how they worked were now asking questions, seeking to learn more, and even sharing their own stories of how the training had helped them on the job. After the speech, Captain Miller approached her. "You've made a real difference, Jennings," he said, shaking her hand. "This program is no longer just something we tried. It's something we believe in." Sarah smiled, but she knew this was only the beginning. She had laid the groundwork, but there was still much to be done. She wanted to expand the program further, reaching more departments, more cities. The impact she had started could spread, and she was determined to see it through. Back home, Sarah sat in her living room, reflecting on the journey. She thought about the officer who had first arrested her, the people who had doubted her, and the countless others who had experienced similar injustices. Despite all the resistance, the setbacks, and the doubts, she had stayed true to her mission. It wasn't just about changing one officer's behavior or one department's practices. It was about creating a ripple effect, a movement toward a more just and fair system of law enforcement. And that, Sarah realized, was her true legacy. As she looked out the window, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the horizon, she felt a sense of peace. She had made a difference. The work wasn't over, but it was no longer just a fight. It was a shared mission. And that was enough to keep her going. She stood up, ready to continue her work. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but now she had the strength, the support, and the belief that real change was possible. And as long as there were people willing to listen, to learn, and to act, she would keep pushing for a better future.